Hi, I'm Ante Jeroncic and welcome to The Craft of Living. Today's episode is going to be on the craft or art of loving in dialogue with Erich From. But first, a couple of updates. So I decided rather than have this time of stream of consciousness, sprawling, sharing of ideas, I always will select just three things. I will pick three things, again, in no particular hierarchical order. They can be very mundane. They can be about a book. It can be about some insight, about some conversation. And the first update that I wanted to give to you is about my experiment with cold water and cold weather exposure. I think last year I shared the reasons why I have decided to become more resilient in that regard. I always used to be very afraid of cold. And even as someone who played water polo often in very cold water, I always detested it and hated it very much. I think I was a scrawny kid, didn't have much of protection in terms of fat, and so I was always very shivering and very cold. And another reason why I decided, it's not just about toughening myself, it's really because I've read a lot about the benefits of cold immersion and these positive stresses that we give to our bodies, such as various types of hydrotherapy and fasting and all of that. I find this to be an incredible source of benefit to me. I just feel so much better. And so I told you that I experimented, I told you last year that I experimented with kind of different degrees of this, walking in my shorts in snow outside, and I eventually graduated in, breaking ice in a pond and immersing myself. It's interesting, in the first time I did it, I wanted to jump out after 10 seconds. My whole body was screaming, my mind was screaming, just get out of here. As a matter of fact, initially I was just dipping my feet into it and I couldn't stand it for 20 seconds. But then over time, as I did it, I repeatedly did it, I cannot say I ever became used to it or have become used to it, but I have now no problem in breaking ice in a pond and submerging myself underneath and being there for, 3, 5, up to 10 minutes, depending on the situation. It is not easy, but it really teaches me, at least has taught me, how to control breathing, how to have a certain mindful attitude towards unpleasant sensations, and rather than pushing them back, simply to analyze them and examine them, which of course is the holy grail of all kinds of different mindfulness practices, this sense of equanimity and experience in the present moment without judgment. Now, if you want to use that basic premise of mindfulness meditation, which is present in many different cultures and religions and walks of life, you can really test it by cold water immersion. I'm not an expert. I know people are doing much greater feats. Some people do it every day. I know some people actually have a chest freezer sealed, right, filled with water, and then they do these immersions every morning. I wanted to do this, but when I suggested it to my wife, she said, do this and I'll kick you out of the house. She didn't say those words, but she said absolutely no. In any case, that was a very interesting experiment. I feel just the benefits of it incredibly great. The second insight or update I wanted to share concerns one of my daily rituals. I've talked about these rituals in the past, perhaps not in specific terms. And I don't really like talking about this not because I don't like to share these things, but because everyone seems to be posting their rituals and morning rituals. Has become a little bit redundant in a sense. I think all of us can just Google morning ritual and you will find different ideas. But these things will kind of seep through as I share things to explain to you how I put some of the things that I share into practice. So that's the only reason why I share these bits of information. Now, I am an early riser. I had to, to train myself somewhat to do that, organize my life around it. I used to be haunted very much by Jocko Willing's Instagram posts, where he, as you might know this, right? The only photo that he posts, or mostly posts, only one type of photo, and that is a photo of his watch in the morning when he hits the gym, and it says usually 4:35, 4:33, 4:34. So very early on in the morning. Now, I always, for some reason, I was always attracted by that. Not because of some reason, some broader philosophical reason, although I know there are many people who extol this as a way of life, and even Henry David Thoreau in the Walden writes about this in a beautiful way in his chapter on the morning. But just a sense, right, of getting up early and before my family wakes up, having really accomplished some things already, gives me just a great feeling. So I usually get up around 4:45, 4:40, sometimes 4:50, depends. And then I do my things that I do, tea and this and that, prepare myself. And then I set aside an hour from 5 to 6 for meditation and prayer and reflection. And I find this to be incredibly meaningful. No one is going to interrupt me that early in the morning, so that is really great. But what I do is then, towards the end of that hour, I set aside 10 minutes. It is usually on this desk, which faces the window, and in front of me have I might share this as well, perhaps. Might as well share this. I have a huge light box. We need those light boxes in Michigan, where we are deprived of a lot of sunshine during the winter, and I really feel very lethargic eventually when February, even in January, I start feeling a little bit, semi-depressed and tired if I don't get enough light. So this big light box, and it's been extremely beneficial for me as well. And at the end of this first hour, I just open my laptop, open my Evernote, and I usually reflect on one of my core values. As I've shared them before, I revised them over the years and even over the last months, but there's 7 of them. And so what I've done is I have allocated each day of the week, one of those values, beginning Sunday and ending with Saturday. So let's say today I'm recording this on the Monday, and the value for today is self-discipline, which I define in a specific way. And so what I do in these 10 minutes, I reread my description of what this is and my vision, what it means to live this out. And then I take some time to either, since all my entries in Evernote are tagged, I click self-discipline or discipline or whatever, some of these tags related to self-discipline, and I read a couple of entries. I like to read at least 1 or 2 journal entries from, let's say, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years ago, especially those marked as essential journey entries where I have some major life insights. Or I might read an article, or I might remind myself of something else in connection with the topic. And then I spend a couple of minutes as I close everything with prayer. Obviously, I have journaled, I write out my meditation, my reflection. So I've already been in this prayerful state of mind throughout this hour. But then at the end, I bring everything to God in a spirit of surrender. And I perhaps repeat something that I've learned from my time of meditation. And then I specifically pray for that one discipline, right? Or this one value that I have, which is self-discipline for today. And then during the day, I keep thinking about it. I keep thinking, okay, like in this situation, how would I have acted if I had this value in my life? And I really try to be mindful of that. And I found this to be incredibly beneficial. I think not necessarily because suddenly I become this perfectly self-disciplined person, but just the level of awareness and this kind of awareness that I then bring to my interaction with God as we dialogue about my life has been just tremendous. I cannot highly recommend this, because if you have your values, if you only have your values and you don't have a way to actually walk with them and reflect on them and plan around them and visualize them and journal on them and reflect on how you have lived them, then they will always remain just some words on a piece of paper. Okay, so these are the two things I wanted to share. There's a third thing, but I think I've taken too much time. So let me break my custom and my rule and just share these two basic updates in my life. And I hope that in the next half of the episode, you will be able to find some things that are according to your liking and for your own personal benefit. In one of my earlier episodes, I tell a little bit about my background and the fact that I became a practicing Christian in the former Yugoslavia, which used to be a socialist country. I also write about the fact how in that context, religious literature, with the exception of a number of Catholic books, was actually hard to come by. So for most of us who have grown up in that milieu, we were quite open to read literature that was perhaps not specifically religious, that didn't speak from any position of biblical authority or biblical convictions, or didn't even speak from a specifically Christian vantage point, but had to do with questions connected with the meaning in life and purpose of life, and had to do with something about some higher values that a lot of my friends used to be quite attracted to this. And we would go to bookstores and scour for that type of literature. As a matter of fact, recently I wrote a chapter for a Festschrift, which is a book dedicated with chapters that different people write in dedication to usually a professor who retires, and then you present him that book in sort of in honor of his or her life work. And in that particular book, I wrote a chapter on worldviews and how worldviews function, what they are, my suspicion about them, about the very concept of worldviews, and all of that. So, but part of that, I actually did share the story of my early conversion experience in my teenage years, and the reason why it was that I and other friends used to be attracted and to different kinds of literature. And I state one of the things that I state, that even though I came to know Christ in a very conservative milieu, that milieu was not at all anti-intellectual, which is very interesting, right? It was conservative, but not fundamentalist. Like no one would ever object the fact that I went to the bookstore and bought a book by Plato. In any case, I shared this experience both in this chapter, which I will eventually post on my blog once it's published, and also in one of my earlier episodes. In any case, so one of those thinkers that really spoke to me in my teenage years was Erich From. I remember buying this book in a Croatian edition, and you can see it right here. It is Fromm. It is his book, The Art of Love, or The Art of Loving, I think, translated in the English language. And this book is not even my copy, but you see a dedication. I gave this to my wife. Oh my, in how many years ago is this now? Oh, too many years. 32 years ago. Okay, anyway, this dates me really. And so this is a book that I bought her, and I tremendously enjoyed reading it. As a matter of fact, quite recently, I had a wedding. Recently, I mean, do I have a date here? I think this was now 2 years ago, I believe. I don't have the exact, I probably could have looked it up, where I titled my sermon, homily or message, I titled it The Art of Loving. And I will share some things with you, if I may, from this message that I shared. And this is what I wrote. Not word, actually. I wrote and then I shared it. And the point that I make in this brief homily is the same that Erich From makes, and that is that love should be understood as a craft. And now just listen to this, because this so well describes what this channel and this podcast is all about. So this is what I wrote, right? I have to say, I really like the language of craft. The language of craft is the language of growing competence and the passage of time needed for that, of character traits such as perseverance and attentiveness, of deliberate practice and practical know-how, the language of wisdom, of properly interpreting things and others, and most certainly the language of interest and love. So this is how I begin my message. I had some other things at the beginning, but that is one of the major points I shared. And then I spoke to these young, very accomplished professionals, and I talk about their skillfulness and how they go about their jobs and their schooling with a high measure of competency and excellency and skillfulness. And then I basically begin that of failure to recognize that skillfulness aspect is perhaps the primary reason why love is so intertwined with frustration. This is so great, isn't it? By the way, let me just read to you on this issue of craft from this book, which is the essential Fromm, Life Between Having and Being. And you might be aware that he was a social theorist, philosopher, existentialist, psychotherapist, and different things. But here's how the chapter on the art of living, which is a series of excerpts, obviously because it is a reader, begins. And it is from an unpublished paper, actually. So this is not something that you can find in any of his other books. And this is what it says. The idea that to live well is easy is a relatively recent one. Not that there were not always people who felt that if they achieved pleasure, power, and wealth, they would be happy. And that what they had to learn was not how to live well, but how to be successful enough to acquire the means to the end of living well. But in contrast to those individuals and groups who practice the principle of radical hedonism, virtually all cultures had their masters of living and their masters of thinking who proclaimed that to live well was an art that had to be learned. I could use this basically as an epigram to much of my life journey, to much of my academic work, and certainly to much of what I do on this channel and podcast. That the learning of this art required effort, devotion, understanding, and patience, and that it was the most important art to learn. Today, in contrast, those who teach men how to live, psychologists, sociologists, and politicians, declare that it is easy to learn. And so that's why we have so many of these how-to books, and he is then critical of that. So that's really an excellent introduction to many of the, well, I would say his key insights. Right? This is the foundational insight to many of the things that he writes. Perhaps that's a better way of putting it. And certainly is at the core of his book, The Art of Loving. And I actually then talked about this in the sermon, right? How that this young couple who certainly is in love, and certainly there's still a measure of infatuation there, that love is something that will not grow on its own, is something that needs to be cultivated. Anyone who has been married and anyone who has any experience in life will, of course, readily recognize that that is the case. Now, the same idea of the art, right? The art of living, he then applies, obviously, to this topic of love. And so what I want to do is, in the rest of this episode, I want to take you through some of these paragraphs and some of these insights and then comment along the way. And he begins the book, chapter 1, which is titled, Is Love an Art?, with the following question. Well, this is the question, right? Is love an art? Then it requires knowledge and effort. Or is love a pleasant sensation, which to experience is a matter of chance, something one falls into if one is lucky? This little book is based on this former premise, while undoubtedly the majority of people today believe in the latter. Right? So he has this, is it an art? Is it something that needs to be learned? Or is it a pleasant sensation? And then he goes through the chapter and he illustrates how people in our contemporary society experience love and understand love. For instance, he writes, most people see the problem of love primarily as that of being loved, rather than of loving, of one's capacity to love. Hence, the problem to them is how to be loved, how to be lovable. And in pursuit of this aim, they follow several paths. And so for many people, the basic question is, how can I be more lovable? And how can I present myself in a way so that I'm more cherished, more accepted, more loved by others? And this was before the rise of social media, the digital revolution that we are experiencing in the last couple of decades. So you can just imagine how this quote speaks to our contemporary situation. Now, I won't go into these details of what he offers here. In other words, his description of the ways in which we try to make ourselves lovable, attractive, the power plays, the managing of image, all these tweets, he doesn't write about this, and social media posts, and all these things that we do to make ourselves more acceptable. Now, there's a second premise right here as well. So the first one being is that rather than having the capacity to love, rather than being loving, people emphasize this need of being loved, or they emphasize or they strive to make themselves into the kind of people who can be loved and will be loved. That's the first thing. The second thing is, he writes, is the attitude that there's nothing to be learned about love. That's the attitude people have, is the assumption the problem of love is the problem of an object, not the problem of a faculty. Faculty as in the faculty of the mind, of the will, kind of these elements of human agency that we possess. People think that to love is simple, but that to find the right object to love or to be loved is difficult. All right, this attitude has several reasons rooted in the development of modern society. And he goes a little bit through history, including the Victorian age, to describe how this intuition or how this basic idea developed in the past centuries. Then he adds another element, and that is that very often love is being viewed as a commodity, right? It rests on the idea of a mutually favorable exchange. He writes, two persons that fall in love when they feel they have found the best object available on the market, considering the limitations of their own exchange values. Great stuff, right? So this is how he goes on, and this is the final paragraph, two paragraphs that I wanted to share, and they're really, really, really great. He says, this attitude that nothing is easier than to love has continued to be the prevalent idea about love in spite of the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, right? It makes sense. There's hardly any activity, any enterprise which is started with such tremendous hopes and expectations, and yet which fails so regularly as love. And then he continues, like, if this were the case with any other activity, anything else we were doing, we would immediately change our approach, right? I'm trying to, do this, I don't know, some element in a sport, but I cannot, shoot. I'm not scoring any baskets. Well, let me change something. Let me change the way I release the ball. I won't even now imitate that. But you know what I'm saying? You try to adapt, you try to tweak things, and we do it all the time in all areas of life. But when it comes to love, we don't do that. And then he tells us at the end here of this chapter, well, I want to speak to this issue. And he indeed does speak. And I believe in the first 3 chapters, he offers the first part of the art of loving, which is theory. He talks about love. His definition of love is love art. We talked about a little bit different theories of love. Actually, this is the first chapter, chapter 2, chapter 3, they talk about love and different understandings of love in society and all that. And then chapter 4 is actually the practice of love. And this is what he says. If I want to learn the art of medicine, I must first know the facts about the human body and about various diseases. When I have all this theoretical knowledge and by no means competent in the art of medicine, I shall become a master in this art only after a great deal of practice, until eventually the results of my theoretical knowledge and the results of my practice are blended into one. My intuition, the essence of the mastery of any art. My wife is very well acquainted with a very respected radiologist who is in his late 70s, perhaps now. He has been in many court cases and he works at Northwestern. I mean, he is such, first of all, a very smart guy, but he's such an expert. I mean, you just give him an X-ray. Obviously, any radiologist will have that competency. But it is amazing. You just give it to him, and for us, it's just some shades. Yeah, you see the rib cage and all this, and he immediately knows. Oh, cancer stage this, or this, or this, or this, or this. And it is really amazing, right? But he has seen thousands, right? I really wonder how many of those has he seen in his life. And that is just art. He is an artist. He's a doctor. He is a well-subsidized doctor, but he's also an artist. And that he mastered this craft. But aside from learning the theory and practice, there's a third factor necessary to becoming a master in the art. The mastery of the art must be a matter of ultimate concern. So this is really this kind of triangulation that's going on, right? You have the theory, you have the practice, and then you have the passion. Like any of these elements is missing, the thing is going to fall apart, right? Just learning and passion, just going to be wishful thinking, right? Passion and practice without knowledge, who knows where you're going to end up, right? Mastery and knowledge, but actually not having any drive to master it, how much will you actually achieve? So these 3 elements are quite important. And you can see even in this, on this channel and on this podcast, that I'm constantly shifting between these 3 poles, right? Knowledge, theory, understanding, specific practices, and then more inspirational things to kind of elicit passion and desire to pursue these important truths about human life and human existence. This holds true for music, for medicine, for carpentry, and for love. And maybe here lies the answer to the question why people in our culture try so rarely to learn this art, in spite of their obvious failures. In spite of the deep-seated craving for love, almost everything else is considered to be more important than love. Success, prestige, money, power, almost all of our energy is used for the learning of how to achieve these aims, and almost none to learn the art of loving. Oh, that is really, really beautiful. Now, I know that some of the questions that people will have, especially people who are coming from a biblical perspective. People will say, well, you're talking about something as if this is, love is something that I can acquire on my own, that I don't even need grace, I don't need even God. And of course, I don't mean that, right? As a Christian, I always believe in this profound interplay between divine grace and human responsiveness. God provides inspiration, brings people into our lives, providential circumstances, internal change, internal transformation. All of these things are incredibly important. They're essential, right? I absolutely believe that they are. But when you look how the Bible speaks about virtues, including love, they're never simply infused into us by some miraculous divine action. They're meant to be pursued. So for instance, in this famous part of the New Testament, every part of the New Testament is famous, right? But a well-known passage in the New Testament that is found in the second letter that Peter wrote in chapter 1, he says right there in the beginning, for this reason, he talks about the grace nature of human existence, right? Everything has been given to us, he says, that we might participate in divine nature. Really a radical claim, actually. Participate in divine nature. And then he tells us how this participation in divine nature actually is taking place. Not through some ontological fusion, not even through some mystical union, but actually in participating in the very character of the divine. That is the primary way of participation. That is this participatory ontology. As we reflect the character of God and the traces of his character, we participate in his being. This is something that Jonathan Edwards writes about quite a lot as well. And so in this connection, right, so we have been given this grace. And how is this being realized? Right? This grace is being given to us. We have been called, everything is coming from God. For this very reason, then he says, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and then to that knowledge, and then self-control and perseverance, godliness, and then affection, and then brotherly sort of mutual affection, and then finally love, right? For this very reason, make every effort to add. And for me, the language of effort is the language of craft. It is the language of actual liberation. It's a language of experimentation. It's a language of trying to figure out what can I do in specific decisions? What can I read? How can I live my day? What book can I perhaps pick up so that I can treat my spouse better? Let me look at my schedule. Do I have enough time for communication with my wife? Do I have this? Do I have that? I mean, trying to understand the needs of my spouse. I'm writing now from my marital relationship, but you can apply to other circumstances, and you can actually see anyone who has been married for a while completely knows this, that even after living with someone for so many years, there are things to learn, things to understand, things to figure out, okay, this is a trigger point for her, this is a trigger point from him. In that circumstance, okay, I've learned my lesson. I won't pick this up in that. So we always triage what is the best time to say things, how to relate to someone, how to make someone happy, what are the basic emotional needs I need to try to satisfy. That's an art, right? It's a way of figuring out who the other person is. And by the grace of God, acquiring these other elements, these other virtues, right? Self-control, without which you cannot really love, right? Perseverance. You can't really love without perseverance because love is kind of an extended thing, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the lessons that I've learned. And one of the most powerful ways, and that brings me now back to this element of divine grace, that rather than God infusing in me this love, or this love being infused from somewhere into me, I have this element of pursuit and God changing some aspects of my character and my way of living that actually present a blockage, right, for love to be shown to others. Whether it be the lack of empathy or a short fuse or reactiveness, whatever it is, or perhaps I don't sleep enough, so I'm always nervous. I mean, there are many different ways in which this art of loving is realized through our mindfulness and planning and carefulness with the aid of God and His transforming power. Wow, that's great. I really feel inspired. I'm really feeling inspired after all of this. This is some beautiful, beautiful truth about human life, human existence, and the craft of living. So thank you so much again for listening. I encourage you to, if you have chance, to pick up some of the Fromm material. You will be inspired as well. But in the meantime, I wish you to live strong and courageously and pursue the craft of living. Until next time, goodbye.